Hi, my name is Murphy Griffin, and welcome to episode 19 of Neophyte Boatwrights. This is the last installment in my planking series where I'll be going over the spiling process and how we fastened all the planks onto the boat. So let's get to it. So as I stated before, I really think of the planking process as broken down into two big sections. Boat prep on the one hand and plank prep on the other hand. So in episode 18, I was really going over the boat prep side of the picture. So you're prepping the boat to receive the plank. So once the boat prep is finished, it's time to start figuring out the shape of the plank that's going to fill the space that you've already prepped. The way you figure out that plank shape is through the spiling process. Now, spiling is just another term for scribing. So when you're spiling, you are scribing out the shape of the next plank. So once the plank is spiled, meaning the shape has been determined and then it's been cut out of some planking stock, the plank then has to be fit to the boat. Fitting requires making all the gains correspond to one another and making sure that the plank is running fair. Once the plank is fit to the boat, you can finally fasten it to the previous plank as well as to the centerline timbers. In traditional and modern boat building, there are numerous ways of fastening the plank to the boat. Namely, you can rivet the plank, you can clinch nail the plank, or you can glue the plank. We opted to rivet the plank to the boat since this is a more traditional build, but clinch nailing and gluing are perfectly viable options. So I'll be going over the spiling and riveting procedures in this episode in full detail. Your main tool when spiling is the spiling batten. Now the spiling batten is serving two purposes. One, it follows the contours of the hull and so it can see the boat in a way that our eyes can't. Two, it's serving as a recording device that you can use to transfer info from the boat to the planking stock. Points are transferred from the hull to the spiling batten using a clever scribing technique that only requires a compass set to a fixed radius. With the points picked up, the spiling batten is then taken to the planking stock, and the points are transferred to the board using the compass technique. So first, let's go over how this compass technique actually works. So here we have the basic setup. You have the previous plank below, the spiling batten overlapping that plank on top of it, and then one of our molds. So we'll start by transferring an arbitrary point from the mold to our spiling batten. You can see that the plank line is also indicated here, and this is the line that you generated when you were lining off the hull. So we'll choose a point on the mold that's also on the plank line. The choice of this point is completely arbitrary. Then, setting the point of our compass on this point, we'll swing a small arc onto the spiling batten. So now you repeat this process, but instead we're going to use a point on the lap line below. What's key here is that throughout the spiling process, you're always using a compass that's set to a fixed radius. Otherwise, it won't work. So at this point, we've picked up the information we need from the hull. Now we're going to transfer it to some planking stock. We'll again choose an arbitrary point, but this time we'll choose it on one of the arcs that we just struck on our spiling batten. Pivoting our compass on this point, we'll strike a small arc onto our planking stock. Again, it's important that we're using the same compass set to the same radius as before. Now we'll do the same thing all over again, but using a different point on the same arc. What you expect to happen is that our two new arcs will intersect each other. And thanks to the magic of geometry, these two arcs will intersect precisely at the original point that we transferred from the hull. This is how we get back to where we originally came from. So this process can be repeated now using the other arc that we transferred from the hull. So with all the points transferred, we can finally set aside our spiling batten. All we have to do now is fair together the top points and fair together the bottom points, and then cut out the shape of our plank. So here you can see a lining batten being used to fair in the spiled points, and then the plank shape being cut out. A circular saw really is the tool for the job. Then there's a final shaping of the plank with a hand plane. Then one more planing before installation. So here's the big picture of the spiling process. You can see our boat in profile and a green and blue line representing the lap line and the planking line respectively. Now here's the spiling batten placed between the lap line and the planking line. What we'd ideally want to do when spiling is to transfer in their entirety the lap line and the planking line onto the spiling batten. But this isn't practical, so instead we approximate these lines with a sequence of points. The spiling batten is then taken off the boat, taken over to the planking stock, and all of these points are transferred to the planking stock using the compass technique described earlier. The top points and the bottom points are then faired together respectively using lining battens to generate the plank shape. This is then cut out of the planking stock and then offered to the boat for fitting. So if only spiling was as simple as I've so far explained. So the procedure is straightforward enough. Using a spiling batten and the compass technique, you're transferring information from the hull to the planking stock and then cutting out whatever shape that generates. Unfortunately, there are some obstacles to getting an accurate result with this procedure, and it all boils down to the shapeliness of the hull. The more dramatic the curvature is in any particular part of the hull, the more challenging it'll be to get the spiling batten to give you reliable results. So what can end up happening is that when putting the spiling batten on the boat, you end up forcing it into position so you can hit all your marks. This ends up causing a phenomenon known as side set. So what happens is when you take the spiling batten off the boat, it bounces back into its original shape, but because you forced it into position, that now distorts the information that you pulled off the boat. Now there are numerous ways to avoid side set in the spiling batten, and one of them is just to avoid forcing it into position. But what I found worked best is instead of having one complete spiling batten that ran from bow to stern, I instead pieced the spiling batten together with smaller sections and then gusseted those sections together. There are a number of advantages to doing it this way. One is that you're not wrestling one big noodly spiling batten, which can be a pretty big headache. The second is that for each little section of the spiling batten, you can cut little curves into those segments so that you don't have to force it into position. So by using all these little sections and gusseting them together, you can really avoid the danger of side set. Now, in the animation where I showed the overview of the spiling process, there was one glaring inaccuracy. And that is when you take the spiling batten off the boat, put it on your planking stock, transfer all the information and fair in all the lines, the plank shape that you generate is often very different from what you expect. Again, this is due to the fact that you're fitting the plank around a curved and twisting shape. To understand how plank shape corresponds to the hull, check out this simple illustration. So what you see here is a simple sphere, and what we're going to do is pretend that the sphere is a boat. Now imagine that we cut a sliver out of our sphere at the equator. We can imagine the sliver as a matching pair of planks, one on the starboard and one on the port. So we'll just look at one half of this sliver, and this will correspond to a plank. Now imagine that we take that sliver off the sphere and we unfurl it. What we'll discover is that it'll unfurl into a straight strip. So the plank shape at the equator is just a straight plank. Now, if we instead look at a pair of planks that are far away from the equator, we'll see something else happen. When we unfurl one of the planks, we discover that the plank shape is curved. So this is a general principle of plank shape. The farther away you are from the equator, the more curved the plank shape will be. The closer to the equator, the straighter. The equator for a boat is what is often called the turn of the bilge. This is where you go from the bottom of the boat to the sides of the boat. So just like with the sphere, the farther away the plank is from the equator, the more distorted it is. And as the planks approach the equator, they get progressively straighter. So often the bottom planks are bent so that the ends are downward. Then gradually, as the planks approach the turn of the bilge, the plank shape starts straightening out. Once you're above the turn of the bilge, the plank shapes start changing again, but now the ends start pointing gradually upward. Now this is just a rough picture. It varies from boat to boat, but at least it gives you a rough idea of what you should expect out of the plank shapes. So here you can see the segmented spiling batten coming off of the hull. I'm being very careful not to jostle it or distort it in any way. It's then carried to the planking stock and the scribe lines are transferred. Everything's fared together with lining battens. And so here you can see the complete plank pattern has been spiled out. We then roughly cut the spiled shape out of the stock. And with 18 total planks, there was a lot of cutting to do. Once the planks were roughly cut out, we'd go back with a hand plane and square up the edges and bring them all down to the spiled lines. Then one last planing down to final thickness. And so with the planks cut out and down to the final thickness, the gains could be cut into the ends before fitting. And once the planks were properly fit, it was time to finally fasten them to the boat. So once the planks are prepared, it's time to fasten them to the boat. We opted for riveting the planks. Riveting is simple in concept, but tricky in execution. It starts with pre-drilling a hole through the pair of planks and then driving the nail through the hole. You then have to set a special type of conical washer called a rove onto the nail. Here you'll see that I'm using a small socket so that the nail can pass through while holding the rove in place and bracing it all with a sledgehammer head. Once the rove is set, it's time to get down to riveting proper. First, you want to trim the nail down. The goal is to leave just the right amount of material. Too much, and the riveting is very difficult. Too little, and you can't actually form a rivet. Once the nail's trimmed, it's time to get down to the riveting. There are two things going on here. One, you're using the peen of a ball peen hammer to form a mushroom head on the cut end of the nail. Meanwhile, you're bracing the head of the nail with something called a buck iron, which is just something that's heavy enough that will prevent the nail from backing out of the hole while you're doing the riveting. So one more time through the process. Pre-drill, drive the nail through, set the rove, trim the nail, and rivet. And that's all there is to it. Now you just have to do it 1,000 times. So riveting is only used when you are attaching two adjacent planks together. Whenever we are attaching the plank to part of the center line, meaning the keel, stem, or transom, we use what are sometimes called holdfast nails. So the general procedure was, once the plank was ready to be installed, wherever it was interfacing with the center line timbers, we applied a bedding compound. Here you can see me slathering on dolphinite with a putty knife. We also made sure to bed the entirety of the gain. The joinery at the gaines is difficult to get a watertight seal, and so the bedding compound is an insurance policy. Then the position for the fasteners is carefully laid out. The pre-drilling process is really a two-step process. First, a narrower bit is plunged the full depth of the fastener. This is particularly important for fastening to oak. Then a heavier gauge bit is plunged just the depth of the plank. This is to prevent the nail from splitting the plank. Finally, the nail is driven in and then set with a nail set. The same procedure is followed at the stem, at the transom, and all along the keel. So with all that covered, it's just rinse and repeat, plank after plank. There are a couple other special notes. First, whenever pre-drilling for the rivets, we found it worked best to drill so that the nail was square to the topmost plank. This is particularly important wherever the bevel is really pronounced. It's easier for the rove to pivot than it is for the head of the nail to bend. Another tricky part of the fastening process is laying out where all the rivets should land. For the best visual effect, you want them all to remain in a line, which can be tricky to lay out on a curving surface. So I used a small batten to help me keep them all lined up. Lastly, if you're riveting, I highly recommend that you do so with a partner. It's much easier to have someone devoted to the bucking while the other person is doing the riveting. As the planks climb, things get pretty tight. So one more time for the people in the back. Here's a full synopsis of the fabrication and installation of the shear planks. Nothing here is different from the previous planks other than the shear planks are made out of white oak. First, the transom bevel was cut, and then all the gaines and bevels in the second to last plank. And then we were ready to spile. Meanwhile, Madison was busy prepping out the white oak for the final planks. The spiled points were then transferred to the oak planking stock, and here you'll notice that the shear planks are incredibly swept. And for that reason we had to employ what's called a dogleg scarf. This is a way of joining two boards together at a pronounced angle. Then the plank was finally cut out, and boy was it swept. Installation of the oak shear planks was extra difficult. One, thanks to the incredible weight of this plank. You can't tell by looking, but it's really heavy. Secondly, the oak wasn't nearly as pliable as the cedar, and so getting it to take all the bends of the hull was challenging. We even had to reinforce the lap clamps with some quick clamps to hold the plank tight. Then the plank was riveted and fastened. And so for all intents and purposes, the planking process was complete. All there was left to do was trim off the excess on the back. So with the boat planked, it was time to start the next leg of the journey. Just as the planking was finished, me and my family were moving the whole operation from Florida to Virginia. So Madison and I gleefully removed all the molds, and haul the boat up into a moving truck. And so with that, we bid a fond farewell to Florida. The rest of the Newfoundland Trap Skiff story will be told from Charles City, Virginia. So that's episode 19. I really hope you enjoyed it. Keep your eyes peeled for another update vid I should be putting out soon, going over everything that's been going on and all the developments since we moved the whole project to Virginia. Don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to this channel, and if you feel so compelled, please consider becoming a patron on our Patreon. On that note, I want to give a shout out to 7 new patrons. So big shout out to Simon Kruger, Y Campus, Bruce Hollett, Chuck Jenkins, Walter Atkins, Brandon Norstead, and Bill Schliefer. Thank y'all so much. See y'all next time.
Ow.